A couple people. Okay. Oh, great. That's actually something like 30%. I wasn't expecting any. But the Institute has several grants. I work on just one of them. It's called Aid Data. Who knows something about Aid Data? Okay. So we'll be talking, in this presentation, we'll be talking about several things. In order, first, what is Aid Data? Why do we exist? What are we trying to do? How do we do it? What does it look like? And how, and this is what I'm really interested in, how might you contribute? So in the interest of full disclosure, I don't know math. I don't know math at all. I'm very comfortable saying I simply don't know it. It's not what I do. I am a geospatial database analyst, so I work mostly with spatial data sets and GIS. Who's heard of GIS? Geographic Information Systems? Okay. And that's my focus. My work in the past has mostly been environmental, for instance, very detailed land cover mapping, estimating forest damage due to hurricanes globally, interpolating temperature based on weather station data, these kinds of spatial problems. But at Aid Data we have a very different set of problems. Space is an element, and I'll show you the two major themes that we work on, what our inputs look like, and what I'm really interested to hear from you, and we can have this as a kind of discussion where you stop me and say, but where do we come in? So what I'm interested in hearing from you is, where do you want to come in? So first I'll show you a bit of one of the websites that we made. So this website, china.aiddata.org, is entirely about development finance from the Chinese government to African country recipients. So the very definition of aid is a bizarre one. Aid is not just money that you give with no strings attached. It can also be grants that have an element of them which is being given up. So basically at a lower interest rate, or a portion of the principal that doesn't have interest on it. The concept of what aid is has strict guidelines according to the OECD, which is basically the club of the world's rich countries, who get together and decide what the definitions of things are, like the aid they give. But there are a lot of peculiarities in the aid world. But to show you the China work, the Chinese government gives a lot of what we would consider to be development finance, or what we can call for short aid. A lot of it is for stuff like infrastructure with roads, electricity, water supply, petroleum, that sort of thing, mining. And the Chinese government will tell you how much the big pot of money they give is, but they won't tell you quite where they're working and quite what they're doing with who. And in fact, this problem is not just relegated to countries that refuse to publish the specific details of their activities for whatever reason, but it's actually a problem for any organization that gives aid. In fact, in general, aid organizations don't really have a handle on where their money is going to and what it's being used for. They don't actually know. Which seems ridiculous, but we'll get into the details. So we have things like fun visualizations that will say, oh, look at all these projects color-coded by the type of work they do or what year they were operating in. So we can start to draw conclusions like, is China giving more money proportionally to its development finance to Ghana than the United States is? And how is this playing out geopolitically? What is the intent of this aid? Is it to develop resources for export? Is it to quell rebellion by an ethnic minority, for instance? Who's trying to do what? But we also, at Aid Data, our money comes from USAID. It comes from basically the United States government. So there are, in fact, things that they would prefer we not really look into. And I can mention a few if you want to speak in private. But I think that's really interesting. But where the money comes from always matters. Where it goes to and where it doesn't go to always matters. So let's talk about getting data from a stone. So imagine, I draw this metaphor like squeezing blood from a stone. You can't really do it. So this is talking about what our inputs are like, and this talk will focus on, basically I offered up several possibilities for what the talk could be on, and the two I got back were, how about topic modeling for aid documents and named entity recognition. So who knows, I don't know much about these topics, I've played with them a bit, but who knows about topic modeling, like what it is, what it's used for? So we might use topic modeling to say, here is a giant pile of documents, tens of thousands of documents, maybe hundreds of thousands, and we know that we can't read them all. It would be impossible. In fact, I don't have the numbers, but I'm almost certain we work with about 70 research assistants whose job is to read documents, but I'm sure we don't have enough. So there's no way that we're reading documents faster than they're being written by every donor agency in the world. I'm sure it's not possible. So basically, we want to maybe read fewer documents, which topic modeling could help us do. So topic modeling could say, here's the body of all of your documents, but really, these 5 are basically about the same thing, and these 1,000 are basically about the same thing. And we could start to find patterns in them. We could read less, for instance. Named entity recognition would be sort of the opposite approach. With named entity recognition, we could say, here's a document, have a computer identify entities like people's names, organization names, dates, amounts of funding, or place names. So, in other words, we could have the computer read the document for entities of interest for us. Then and this is where I don't, so I can make that happen. Like I can go to software that people have built and say, show me the organization names and the place names and stuff like that. But what I can't figure out is, how do I know which ones are the ones I care about? Because a given document may have thousands of dollar amounts, for instance, but I'm really only interested in maybe one, which is how much funding was the total funding for this project. But there might be funding of other projects referenced, or fundings that the project is a small subset of, for example. So parsing that out would be very difficult. But let's talk about, so this is data from a stone, PDF ghettos, and aid transparency. Aid transparency is part of a broader, what you might call open data movement. So who's heard about this concept of open data? You guys must know about open source software, like R, for instance, is open source. So open data is like open source software, but for data. You can, you're showing everything to everyone. You're not trying to conceal anything. You make it easily consumable. You make studies with it easily repeatable. So this movement exists in many fields. Things like country budgets have an open data movement. The UK, by the way, is excellent when it comes to government open data. But we're just talking about aid transparency, which is open data as it relates to the world of international development finance, which we're usually used to calling aid. This is just a fun picture of some partners we worked with in Nepal. So they're looking, this group was called CPRED, and their interest was agricultural outputs in countryside villages in Nepal, and how that related to the caste system and supplies of fertilizer, use of pesticides. So they just wanted to know, where are the aid projects that affect these villages? And that's something that is actually an extremely difficult question to answer for reasons that we'll explore. So remember, we're trying to do this worldwide. So basically our problem is, no one quite knows where aid ends up or quite what it's used for. There are many reasons for that. So I know this sounds completely ridiculous, right? Like, how can literally trillions of dollars be doled out to different recipients and no one really knows what's happening? Record keeping is a major issue. So USAID, which is a US government agency, gave us, as an institute, we have a grant for $25 million to solve this problem. Where is aid coming from? Where does it go? When? What is it for? So obviously, this problem is not solved. They wouldn't, well, it could be some kind of complicated boondoggle, but I don't think so. I don't remember any congressional report about how they were going to hand out money to create jobs in Williamsburg, right? I think that this is a real problem. So our goal, who provides aid, to whom, where, when, for what? What does it end up looking like? Here's one example for Sudan. So this is projects where the Chinese government is a donor, or various Western countries are donors. And the bubbles are sized by how much project funding went to that project. So for a location, you could say, This is a ton of Chinese funding for this spot, and this is a ton of Western funding for a spot. So the question is, subnationally, where is aid going? And on the national scale, these numbers are pretty well known. People are pretty comfortable with Sudan gets this much money as a gigantic pot. And we can even say, this is how much money China gives to Sudan as a gigantic pot. But we want to know specifically what they're trying to fund. And if you look at the subnational level, there are many different questions you can answer. If you start to think spatially, you'll see how, here's an example. So the United States has pretty low under 5 mortality. Generally, in the United States, compared to the world average, children do not die before the age of 5. But if you disaggregate over space, if you consider LA, there are neighborhoods in LA where under 5 mortality is the same as Norway, and neighborhoods where it's the same as Jamaica, for example. So disaggregating spatially shows you tremendous variance in a data set. There's often more variation inside a country than between two countries. Do we have any questions so far? Okay. So why am I here? We want to automate the extraction of entities like organizations, dates, amounts of money, place names. These are the things that we record from aid documents. And we want to organize documents by topic. So we have more documents than we could ever read by hand, and there's more stuff in them than we know what to do with. So we could reduce the number of documents we need to look at. So how do we achieve our goal of describing who gives aid to whom, where, when, and why? We break this down into 2 kinds of tasks. We call them geocoding and activity coding. Geocoding answers the where. Where is this project taking place on a subnational level? Not just it happened in Sudan, but these are the towns that have happened in Sudan. This is the river that was affected, the road that was built, that sort of thing. So we basically have, in GIS these are called gazetteers, which is just a fancy name for a giant list of places. We pull from a list of places that's public, it's called geonames. You can see it on geonames.org. That itself is just an aggregate of many gazetteers. It's a huge list of place names with many alternate spellings. Each place name is available in many languages. It describes what kind of feature that place is, like is it the capital of a nation? Is it a river? Is it a mountaintop? And it provides latitude and longitude, which are the coordinates we would need to map that feature. So that's geocoding. Our other major activity is activity coding, which is, so geocoding is something that everybody who works with GIS does. Activity coding is, the way we're thinking about it is peculiar to the aid world. So really, remember I was telling you about the OECD, that's the Club of Rich Countries. They have an organization called the Donor Assistance Committee, the DAC, and the DAC has a list of 200 purpose codes, which they use. It's a number that describes what is the purpose of this aid project. Is it for health? Is it for education, for example? Aid data goes a bit further and breaks that down into 544 codes. So these are just descriptions of what a project is doing. And one project may have many codes. And we've just started to code by project location. So when you go to that place in Sudan and say, here's where the project is, we can also say, yes, and for that spot, these are the activities that are happening. So examples of codes. 21040.02. This is something that a bunch of the senior aid data people all have memorized and they've been doing for years, which is ridiculous in my mind. They have t-shirts with the codes in the back, and there's a story that one professor tells about these students that rang on his doorbell on Halloween and they were dressed as activity codes, which is, this kind of culture that develops is bizarre. But this is how specific they are. This code is harbor guidance systems, which might be something like an automated lighthouse, maybe something with GPS equivalent. I don't know what harbors are like. Something like the harbor equivalent of air traffic control. Or 3115.003, supply of fertilizers for agriculture. So these are quite specific. Or 160.1010, social mitigation of HIV/AIDS. So you can already see how this system has its own problems, like what does social mitigation of HIV/AIDS mean? I don't know because I was never trained in activity coding. We can get better at this system, but we have this list of 544 codes which we assign to projects. A project may have many documents. Some documents, this is the worst part, most documents talk about many projects. That's the most difficult part.
So is this code if it start with 1 means something, start with 2? Okay, so this is some system in there.
Yeah, so it's a hierarchy where the decimal is used to